What's up, people? Today's an exciting day because I'm finally reviewing a downhill bike. It's been way too long since I've had something with 200 mils of travel. The opportunity came up from a buddy to pick up this frame, so couldn't say no. I did a big trip up through the Pacific Northwest in Canada, hit quite a few bike parks, and now I'm going to talk about it. So let's get into reviewing the Transition TR11. So like I said, it's been quite a while since I've owned a legit downhill bike, especially a modern one. I mean, I've kept the Sunday in action, rode that a bit earlier this year. You know, I put the dual crown on the Geometron, rode that in Whistler earlier in the summer as well, but like I was really craving a proper downhill bike. And like I said, had the opportunity to buy this frame for cheap, so whipped this thing together and rode it a decent amount. Maybe not as much as I would like for how thorough I like to do my reviews usually, but I did a few days at Whitefish in Montana. I rode it at Sun Peaks and in Whistler. So we've got a pretty good idea of what's going on here. To start, I'm 6'1", this is a large, and I've got a bit of a history with transition downhill bikes. I rode and raced the TR500 for a season, and that was one of my favorite downhill bikes. And I think kind of Transition's MO when it comes to their downhill bikes and maybe their bikes in general is just creating something that's like fairly simple. It's not revolutionary. They're not trying to reinvent the wheel, but it's just solid, predictable, and it works well, or well enough. And they are usually like really fun to ride. At least that's what I remember about the TR500. So I think this TR11 kind of still embodies that same ethos where it's like, you look at it and it's just kind of like the most generic downhill bike you could come up with. It's not trying to be something special. And it really isn't. So initially when I hopped on this thing, I was pretty fired up. Then when I really started to push this thing a little bit harder and try and suss out the setup, I mean, all the way through the end of my time in Whistler, I just feel like I was searching for something in the suspension setup mainly. I mean, I do have the O-chain on here, which, you know, theoretically should kind of help the feedback and just settle the bike out a little bit. It felt like no matter what I did with this shock, like it just really wasn't settling into the travel how I feel like a downhill bike should. It felt like even if when I was running the shock, like obviously too soft for me, I still wasn't getting full travel. And I just tested it out to see like how far it goes through its stroke before it actually hits bottom out. And it's like pretty much all the way. But like when I was actually riding it, I mean, most of the time, even when the shock was definitely too soft, in the initial part of the stroke, I was only getting to like here. Yeah, it had a bunch of support, especially when I was running like a proper sag number, but there just wasn't that feeling of it settling into its stroke. And combined with the fact that I feel this bike is pretty bad under braking, it just made me really not feel the level of confidence I was looking for. I think I've felt bikes with a lot less travel that manage it a lot better. And one thing I did to kind of adjust for the geometry on this thing, which I guess I'll get into now, it comes with a 62-degree head angle, which is really slack. And I heard some of the team guys talking about putting steeper angle sets in there. So I put a steep angle set in it, and I think I went too steep, but I put a positive 1.5 degree angle set to theoretically get the head angle to 63.5. which I think is like a fairly reasonable number. It's where a lot of downhill bikes are these days. However, riding this bike more and kind of coming to grips with like how the shock was behaving and how the bike seemed to stiffen up under braking, I started to understand why a really slack 62-degree head angles would have made sense. Is because in the steeps, it just felt like the bike was pitching me forward, making the head angle even steeper. So I feel like an overly slack head tube angle would have actually helped the whole package of the bike, given the kind of limitations of the rear suspension or just how it's tuned, in my perspective. I've got an idea of what I want looking on a geometry sheet, but it is a little bit more nuanced than that with how different characteristics of the bike complement each other. And even riding with a fairly high bar height, I was just always pretty apprehensive in the steep, rough stuff. And I did end up having a crash where, you know, it's obviously like the rider's fault, but I don't think the bike helped me. I was, riding a steeper sustained rock face and on the brakes, and I do feel like I got pitched a little bit forward. Then when I G'd out, my wheels hung up on some rocks I didn't quite see, and I like got slammed over the front of the bike. It was a situation where I feel like the bike wasn't settling. Like, I'd be curious to see the anti-squat numbers, because it just didn't feel like the bike was hooking up and settling under braking. It was doing the opposite, where the rear suspension was like firming up and like extending. And who knows, but I do feel like that could have contributed to that crash. My other reference point for riding this bike on the same trails is the Geometron, which I had set up with the dual crown fork at 180 mils. And I did get one lap on the Intense M1. Henry from Pink Bike was actually kind enough to let me ride it. And starting with the M1, on my second lap, like with that bike, I've never felt more confident, maybe ever. So that's where I go back to this, and like, I don't think I'm making this up. Like, that is a reference point of a modern downhill bike where it was absurdly confidence inspiring in the rough stuff. Like, it's hard to describe. I felt like that bike, the suspension almost had no compromises. Maybe it wasn't the most playful and responsive, but like, braking traction, composure in the steep and the rough was just like out of this world. And I was on my way to like putting down one of my best Whistler downhill runs of all time before I just flat spotted the rim and pretty much blew up the wheel. So my apologies to Henry for doing that, but when I compare it to this bike, like, my level of confidence in those same sections was like, it's almost not even comparable. That's where I just think this bike is maybe targeted at a different riding style or audience. And I see a lot of the free ride guys, doing crazy stuff on this bike. And I do think it's just more tailored to that style of riding. And for me personally, like, especially riding Whistler and stuff, going back to the Geometron, like, the Geometron is massive, like, gotta be like 40 or 50 mils longer in wheelbase. If we're comparing it on like A-Line and Dirt Merchant, in those situations, like, the lips and landings are so fucking big at Whistler, and they're so dialed that like, having a long or short bike to me almost doesn't matter. I was running the Geometron in the shorter travel setting, but the confidence that that bike's geometry gave me, and the rear suspension was honestly working really well for it being much shorter travel. Like, I was able to ride the Geometron in the tech at a much higher level than I was the TR11, unfortunately. The TR11 did give me more of that downhill bike feel, but yeah, I had some laps on the Geometron that were pretty intense, and I was really pushing myself. And when the suspension kind of ran out of support and composure, like, the geometry on that bike really saved me from having some huge moments. Whereas this, I feel like the suspension kind of ran out of composure at a similar level, even though it has more travel, maybe even less. But the geometry on this bike is in a much more, normal realm. And it didn't give me that space to really like save myself if I got out of shape, which I feel like the suspension was kind of putting me in situations where I was getting out of shape in the technical stuff. Finishing up on geometry with this bike, it does have a 450 mil chainstay. So in the corners, it felt really good. Plenty of grip on the front end. Again, I do think that going to a slacker head angle, or just the stock head angle, or maybe somewhere in between, may have helped this bike a little bit, but this bike cornered really well. And I was able to link together some sweet drifts. And given that it was like, a bit shorter, the reach on this is 475 mils. Like, even going through Ho Chi Minh, Ninja Cougar and stuff like that, it was able to navigate some of the tighter, more technical stuff that wasn't like super aggressive or steep or rough pretty well. And it kind of had like a bit more support in the suspension to pump, generate speed. So that's honestly where I felt like this bike was performing the best. And one trail where I actually think this bike did exceptionally well was 2 Mushroom. It's kind of a really natural, more enduro style trail, and it's like not super steep, but on this bike I was able to pump through the compressions really well. And I don't know, I had one of my best laps on 2 Mushroom on this bike. So it's almost like its strengths aren't as much downhill bike-esque, but you get a more responsive, playful package in a downhill bike package. I would be really curious about running this bike with a coil shock. I do think if I was able to figure out the shock on this bike, it probably could have transformed the entire experience. It feels like the frame is plenty progressive enough, and I think having a coil shock would have brought a lot more comfort and allowed the bike to just like settle into its travel a little bit. Like, I'm kind of perplexed by it. Like I said, even with this O-chain, it just felt like I was getting so much feedback, and it was just like cock, cock, cock. I mean, for lack of a better description, it was just, I could feel every hit coming in through the rear suspension, and I'm like, man, just settle in back there, give me a break. So just some other things around the bike. I do really like that they have a dropout adjust for the chainstay length. That just means that a wider range of people can find a happier spot with the bike. You guys know I'm long chainstay guy, so this is honestly, it's like one of my biggest requirements for looking at a bike, and being that I could put this at 450 chainstay, you know, made me really happy and brings the cornering characteristic I like into the bike. But if you want shorter, you've got that option too. Does come with a lot of headset cup options. One thing that I ran into, I had like the most freak mechanical on this bike. This brake mount, the bolts that mount it to the frame come from the inside of the rear triangle on the disc side, and one of them backed out into the brake rotor, so it made this horrible screeching noise. But when I went to take the wheel off to get the rotor out of the way to tighten the bolt, my axle on my other wheel had snapped, so I wasn't able to get the axle of the bike out. So I was just stuck with this like Rubik's Cube of problems that I couldn't figure out, and I ended up having to walk my bike down the hill. So that's maybe one note, is just double check that these brake mount bolts are tight, because if they back out, I mean, it wouldn't have really been an issue if my axle wasn't stuck in my bike, but it was. So that's just a quick note. So yeah, I think this is a very approachable bike. It'll probably feel maybe a little bit not as big of a leap if you're coming from a trail bike. And if you're looking for a little bit more of a responsive ride, if you like doing jumps, tricks, not tamer trails, but trails that benefit more from giving input to the bike, this is still a good fit. It's a pretty easy bike to get along with, but when you're pushing it to that next level that is kind of in more of like a downhill race environment, going fast on rough tracks in the steep, I don't think this is the best option. It didn't give me the most confidence, and in those situations, it really makes me crave something like the Intense, which absolutely blew my mind. I would love to ride that bike more than the 2 runs I got on it, but even those 2 runs is all I need to know that the level of the modern downhill race bike is just absurdly high. But this is a bit of a different flavor. I wouldn't put those 2 bikes in the same category. So I was super stoked to have a downhill bike for my little Pacific Northwest bike park tour. But that's my 2 cents, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Thanks.